Welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Madeline DiNono, CEO of the Institute. With us, as always, is our wonderful ASL interpreter, Andrea Lust. And if you aren't seeing Andrea, that means that you haven't set your Zoom to gallery view, so please do that. And to get started, I wanted to quote the Honorable and legendary civil rights leader, John Lewis. Nothing can stop the power of a committed and determined people. Why? People who will make a difference in our society, because human beings are the most dynamic link to the divine on this planet. And being an ally and making a difference is an action and not a moment, which brings us to our topic for today, which is allyship for the long haul. So before I get started, I just want to explain what we're doing so you all know to stay tuned all the way to the end. Unfortunately, Geena is in a location that did not allow her to get onto the internet or even use her cell phone. So unfortunately, our tech didn't work for her, so she won't be joining us today. In a moment, you're going to hear a brief research presentation from Dr. Caroline Heldman, who leads our research and insights at the Institute, just to kind of frame our conversation on, allyship and the dimensions of allyship. After Caroline, I'm going to moderate a panel with an esteemed group of subject matter experts, and then Dr. Nicole Haggard, who is our Director of Communications, is going to come on and talk about an allyship action plan and also closing remarks, and then we're going to go to Q&A. And on the note of Q&A, while we're on this session, just start putting in your questions for the Q&A, and then we'll be able to address that. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Caroline Heldman, who is our Head of Research and Insights. She is, I don't know if you can see my screen, an award-winning author. She is a political commentator for Spectrum and CNN, and she is a 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo, a great person to travel with. I've had the pleasure of traveling all over the world with her. So take it away, Caroline.
Thank you, Madeline. So my role here today is to bring us all into this space with a little knowledge about how marginalized groups in our society are represented in media. And you're all here because you work in the industry or you're affiliated with the industry, and you want the world to be a better place. We're all here for the same reason. And what is so fascinating about the work that we do is that it matters, right? The stories we tell and the worlds that we create have a profound effect on shaping our culture. So I'm going to quickly give you an overview of where representation is for the 6 groups that the Institute focuses on. We focus on gender, race, sexuality, LGBTQ+. We also focus on disability, age, with a focus on older adults, and body size with a focus on large body types. So I am going to now turn to just a quick slide from our analysis of 100 top family films from the previous year, starting with gender. So where are we in terms of gender and representation in the industry? Well, we are at 48% in terms of leads in family film, which is very close to the 51% of women in the broader population. So if you see the little bar up above, that's the point that we want to get to if we want to achieve parity, and we're pretty much there. But it's not just about who's showing up, it's also about how they're represented. So as you can tell, even though women are showing up as lead characters and as characters overall in family content in ways that represent their numbers in the broader population, they're far more likely to be sexually objectified than male characters. So they're not showing up in quite the same way. When it comes to race and ethnicity, 38% of the US population are people of color. 30% of leading characters are people of color. And that number has moved quite a bit in the past decade, as I'll show you in a bit. However, still underrepresented. And also, when characters of color show up, they're represented in ways that are different from white characters. I pulled out one finding that I thought was particularly significant, and that is that characters of color are less likely to be shown as upper class than white characters, which reinforces negative stereotypes associated with socioeconomic status in people of color. Moving to LGBTQ plus character representation, 4.5% of people in the US identify as LGBTQ plus, but only half that number are showing up as leading characters in family content. What we also find is that when LGBTQ plus characters show up, they are 3 times more likely to be shown as sexually promiscuous, which reinforces negative stereotypes about this group of Americans. Our fourth group that we're looking at, people with disabilities, 8% of leading characters are shown with disabilities, even though 19% of the US population has a communication, physical, or cognitive disability. And we also know that when characters with disabilities are represented, they are twice as likely to die in family content as other characters. When it comes to age, we're focusing on this slide on folks who are 60 plus. About 1 in 4 Americans are ages 60 plus, but only 3.5% of leading characters. So older Americans are vastly underrepresented in family content. And we also know that when they show up, they're less likely to be shown as having an occupation, far less likely, which means that they're shown as less productive members of society. Last but certainly not least, 39% of Americans have large body types, but only 6.8% of leading characters have large body types in family content. And also 10% of characters are shown with large body types are shown as a punchline, meaning that their bodies, their size is the punchline, something that we're being asked to laugh at, which is highly degrading. I don't want to end on a negative note. I want to talk about the progress that we've made. The Geena Davis Institute has been around since 2004. And during this time, we've been pushing for gender first and then race equity and now other identities in terms of representation. And you can see over time that we've made significant progress. When it comes to female leads in family films, we've achieved statistical parity, and when it comes to leads of color, lots of folks have been working on this, including us, and we're not there yet, but we've made significant progress in the last decade. And so now we're going to turn to talk about allyship. At the core of allyship, the reason that we're all here is that we understand that even if we do not belong to one of these marginalized groups, our liberation is bound up with the liberation and better representation of marginalized groups, and that's at the heart of what we do at the Institute. So passing the baton to you, Madeline DeNono.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And there are a few of you are asking questions about the research, which Caroline will be back for the Q&A. So just please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll definitely get to it. So now I'm being joined by such a blessed and esteemed group of experts, and I'm going to ask them to put their cameras on. And I want to welcome Erica Alexander, who's an award-winning actor, co-founder and chief creative officer of Color Farm Media, and you may know her as Maxine Shaw from Living Single. Next is Todds Sears, who is the founder and principal of Out Leadership. Next, we have Tatiana Lee, actress, model, speaker, influencer, and Hollywood Inclusion Associate at Respectability. And last but not least, Virgie Tovar, author and activist, The Self-Love Revolution, Radical Body Positivity for Girls of Color, right here on my desk. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. So based on the time that we have today, I'm only going to be able to ask kind of 2 rounds of questions for each of our esteemed panelists. We could do sessions with each one of them that could go on for hours. And I'm going to frame my question with a little bit of a story about each of them. And I am going to start with with Erica. So this round of question is about how you came into your allyship and how your life experiences has led to your allyship. But Erica, you're one of 6 children, growing up in, Philadelphia. You became a star at 14. You became the breadwinner, for your family. So how has your experiences informed and defined your allyship? That's got a one big bucket. And then I do want you to talk about the impact of the character Maxine Shaw, because it had huge impact on women, and then particularly women of color. And then I'll also have you also talk a little bit about why, Color Farm Media. But the question is really how all of this experience that you've had has led to allyship, for you, and what has informed that.
Thank you first for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and everyone. I really appreciate and have admired the work that the Institute does, especially on gender and inside of media. I see that those changes have been significant, and I believe that putting your energy into that has created a lot of valuable changes and a blueprint for us all. So allyship, to me, I've been thinking about that word because I know how some people define it, but for me, it seems to always be down to what people who have, say, race privilege or it could be class privilege, can align themselves with people who have less of a voice. That's how I feel about it. And I've often thought that for me, I needed to flip it. Maybe it's just, the maverick in me that wants to say, I feel like I'm aligned to help those people. And that we're the aliens that white people took from across the ocean to rock their world and make their planets twirl. It has been a long journey to this point, but I think in finding our own humanity, and not just tied up in like saying we need help, we're saying, no, we're here to help you. We're here to help you move forward and to absolutely unrecreate, as Baldwin said, the nigger that you needed to create in order to rule the world. And there's a better version of us all tied up in that and a different story. So I think of myself and why I'm here on this planet, a little bit of why maybe I've been chosen out of all those girls they could have chosen in Philadelphia, in Merchant Ivory on that day, me in a position to use what I learned having already traveled the world. So even though I was in Philadelphia, I'm actually from Arizona up in the mountains. I'm I'm one of 6, as you said, Madeline. I'm also, both my parents were orphans. I lived the first 11 years of my life in a hotel called Starlight off of Route 66. We depended on the kindness of strangers, and we saw very clearly that the social contract that we all depend on in America and across the world has to be nurtured. And it can't be because it suits me or I'm gonna get something from it. It just should be automatic to say that even if I never see anything from this, I'm gonna give my true all self to it, not as like an afterthought, but as a job. To be a good citizen in this world should be my job. And we're talking about John Lewis, and he's here on the background, and God bless him. But he did good for goodness sake. That's the truth. That's why that man is good. It's amazing now, with all the wonderful accolades we could give to people, that I think one of the highest honors is to say that they were good. They were good people, good man, good woman, good person. I find that to be, when people say Erica's a good person, I love that, as I try to be good. I try to make decisions that are good and say, you know what, I'm tired, but I know that's the good thing to do. That person, that organization needs me. I'm gonna show up and give them my A game. I'm gonna show up and not ask for anything in return and look on and wish them the best. I'm also going to sacrifice something, not just in money and time, but I'm gonna see how I can do the most for everybody by not being greedy in any one moment and saying, well, how's that gonna affect other people coming? how can we make better choices inside of that? So that's what I think Madeline is. I'm always trying to define allyship and for what it means to me. And I feel like I'm in this world, and if I'm experiencing some sort of real hardship, we're looking at George Floyd and he's being strangled in those streets. Everybody, red, blue, everybody saw that as murder. It shouldn't have taken that much to lift the corporations and the organizations that have that kind of outreach to do the right thing. They knew those systems that they had inside of their corporations were not promoting Blacks and Browns. They knew they had them at interim beginning levels, but they didn't give them any real power because they'd have to lose power to get it. So they thought, no, they'd have to step aside to get it. They already, to me, if you step aside, that is power. You say, there's a lot of white males here. I need to see, as you say, 30% people of color, and I'm going to be very specific, Black people, and people don't like those words, but that's real to say. It needs to look different, and we need to make that change. And that means some of y'all not going to have this job tomorrow, but you're going to do well because of this. And I think that that's what it's going to take. And I've been finding that it's been phenomenal. Unfortunately, one of the most unfortunate thing, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, all this, Breonna Taylor has brought about a sea change. And I hope that that helps.
So you started talking about, job, and I also wanted you, because it was very, very important when we talk about seeing people and redefining the narrative. We know, because we know you so well, that when you played the character of Maxine Shaw, you changed the lives of many people from something made up in fiction. And I don't want to move on to Todd before talking about that. And then also how Color Farm is part of your allyship also in terms of your advocacy. So if you could just hit those 2 points, and then I'll move on to Todd.
Sure. Maxine Shaw was a character I played in Living Single, and she was a young lawyer. And it was just at the beginning of the 90s, just after Cosby Show had left. And we had the example of Claire Huxtable and Different World and a few other shows. But the thing that had changed was that we were seeing that shows with Black casts could be not only valuable, but instructive. I didn't know then that that character would be instructive to a lot of young people, Black and white, but especially young Black women who saw that and thought of it as a powerful leadership role, and that they'd either go into law or leadership positions because of it. So when suddenly I meet Stacey Abrams, and Stacey Abrams comes up to me, because of you, I am a lawyer. I meet Ayanna Pressley, who says, oh my gosh, do you know what that character meant to me? I'm here because of that character. I meet Mayor de Blasio and First Lady Charlene, and they say the same things. And Marilyn Mosby, who's over there in the position of the state's attorney in Maryland. And I meet 5 judges that were just voted for in 2018, 5 from Texas, and they run me down in the street and start screaming and crying and say, we're judges because we saw. Let me tell you something. Representation not only matters, it's essential. If we want to see that world we're talking about where there's better social justice, then we need to see more lawyers in those positions who understand the people that they are defending and or prosecuting, frankly. And I think that for me, needed for me to grow up and to grow out of it, because I have no college training. I went to high school at the girls' high, and I was just faking like I was my dad, who was a preacher, and every sort of authority figure I had ever met. I went to a really good school, and I had Black and white teachers and instructors who did not let us get by on any simple excuse. So I was faking like I was them. That what law meant to me, authority. But the thing that I needed to see was my mother and people like who I admire, Hillary Clinton. There were a lot of people that were basing this sort of thing like, you're not going to tell me what to do as a woman. But I had gone to an all-girls high school. I needed to see those women who were my teachers telling me how I could be. and that I didn't have to be just left up to my boobs and my vagina and people seeing what this was. So that's what Max was. Max is a study in women's movement. That's what she was. The other thing with Color Farm Media is Color Farm Media is a company that I started because of that day that I got discovered. When I left, there were thousands of other girls that did not get chosen. And I was told by my agent at the time that I would never be an ingenue. No one would ever mistake me for an ingenue. I was just 19. She was saying that I would never be the damsel in distress. I would never be the person of the object of desire. And at the time, as an actress, I thought, wow, I can't wait to do those roles. She thought it was a backhanded compliment to say, oh, you're mature and you do heavier roles. No, you mean I have to suffer and be foster kids and slaves? And that's exact, and prostitutes. Those are exact 3 first roles that I played coming into this business. There were no ingenues. There were no Jada Pinkett's. There were no Black ingenues. They hadn't even come yet. And Viola Davis was almost 2 decades in front of me. They were in school. I was already working. So I made Color Farm Media because I realized there were 4 biases I wanted to talk about: gender, racial, sexual, and also ageism, but also, well, geographic. Geographic was huge. That wherever you were, if you were in the Appalachian Mountains and you were the Dolly Parton, was there somebody there to support you in the Blue Ridge Mountains or the Delta down there? Was there somebody there to support the new Chadwick Bosemans and all of that who can't get representation here? How come Hollywood looks that way? They can look through a roster and have a ton of white male faces and white female faces and that, but then they have a roster of people of color that they consign to their people of color agents that they give no power to. All of that needs to change, because fundamentally, if we start telling our stories right, there will be less George Floyds. You will not see Ahmaud Arbery running through that street and shoot him. You will see him as a young person who has potential and possibility, and look at, he's on a run, he's trying to get better health. So the stories we tell ourselves and the lies we told ourselves have gotten us up to this point. Color Farm is there to try to mitigate that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So Todd, Erica was talking about doing the right thing, and, moving over to you, doing good can be good for business. And, in reading about you, and particularly in a wonderful Forbes article, you came out as a teenager, and you were inspired by Larry Kramer, and the title of your article was The Destiny of Me, which you said inspired your activism. And then, right out of Duke, jumped into Merrill Lynch, and there was something that happened in your work there with one of your supervisors. And I think I'd love for you to talk about that, because I think that also built on the trajectory of you becoming an activist, but also learning that doing good can be, good for business. So how did your, experiences as being maybe one of the few openly, gay financial advisors, on Wall Street, and your experiences, as a teenager and then coming out of college, how has that informed your allyship and your advocacy? So I know it's a big chunky question, but I wanted people to really understand the context. You didn't just wake up one day and decided to, create your company. Like, there was a whole trajectory that led up to it. So I'd love for you to walk us through, that story, which I think is so rich and so important.
Well, thank you. And I just want to give kudos to Erica. Thank you for all of your visible activism for a very long time. My entire team is watching, and they've all including me, of course, have been fans for a super long time. We're all fangirling. So thank you. So I, as you mentioned, Melon, I actually came out when I was 18. I grew up in the South in North Carolina, and I went to Duke, and I never really had an issue being LGBT until I came to New York and I went to Wall Street. My first firm was not Merrill Lynch, actually. It was Schroeder's before Salomon Brothers bought them, and I had a homophobic boss. And so, he used the faggot word constantly, and so I went back in the closet and found a new job. And ultimately, from then on in my career, I decided I would only ever be out. And what that allowed me to do in my second investment bank was to actually start to focus on the LGBT market opportunity. And this is the late 90s. And when I switched sides of the banking world, I went to Merrill Lynch and put together a business plan, because if you know how financial advisors work, they give you a phone, a desk, a computer. They say, bring in $1 million a month of new assets to manage. And if after 8 months, you don't have $8 million under management, you're fired. I was 25 at the time, 24 and a half. And I looked around, and believe it or not, in 2001, not a single Wall Street firm had focused on LGBTQ people. And at that time, there were over 1,049 rights at a federal level the gay couples did not receive, because marriage equality was not a reality in our country. And about 90% of those issues were financial. And so I thought, well, could I put together a business plan for how we could actually, as a firm and a company, service the community and also bring in clients? And in the first 12 months, I brought in $100 million. And in the first 4 years, I brought in $2 billion. Which thank you, Erica, which was great, because I got to keep my job. But also because I proved it, I really framed everything as a business initiative. I didn't go in and saying this is the right thing to do, because of course it was, but I went and I tracked ROI. And so when the CEO and I sat down after my first year, I asked him for assets to actually invest, so that ultimately we had over 250 financial advisors like me servicing gay couples, helping them protect their families, and working with LGBTQ nonprofits, helping them raise their endowments, et cetera. So that ultimately led me into the diversity space. So I ran diversity strategy for Merrill and then Credit Suisse. And then in 2010, I got laid off and took my severance check and sat on my sofa with multiple martinis and thought, all right, what the hell's next? And 10 years ago, you did not see businesses leveraging their economic power to advocate for LGBT equality. You did not see CEOs speaking up on these issues. And I'd learned that I could do that with an old conservative Irish Catholic command and control firm like Merrill. Maybe I could do that with other companies. And so I started out Leadership. And the idea was very simple. I wanted to convene business leaders, CEO hosted summits, to talk about business, talent, and equality, but in that order. I wanted them in the room because it was a business imperative. And the talent that they needed to actually achieve that business imperative had to be supported and developed. And then equality was the output, not the starting point. And so we grew from there. So I launched in Europe 9 years ago, in Asia 8 years ago. We were the first LGBT summit ever in Asia, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Sydney, Australia. We now have 78 companies, 500 CEOs. We have 3 talent initiatives, one for LGBT young people, one for LGBT women, one for LGBT board leadership. And all of that journey has been focused on intersectional conversations and intersectional allyship. And one of the biggest things that, you know, as it relates to me being an ally, but ultimately getting these C-suite leaders to be allies, are a few things. One, I say that allies have to come out, because we don't know, like, just keeping it in the LGBT spectrum for just a second, we don't know that you're an ally unless you tell us. And we are the invisible minority. So you don't know who we are unless we tell you. Right, so LGBTQ people have to come out constantly. It's not a one-time thing. You don't just come out one day when you're 18. You come out in every single meeting you walk into and every single company you walk into, right? If you walk in as a woman, people know you're a woman. But if you walk in as a lesbian, they may not know that. So the same thing is true for allies. And in the gay community, we have a thing that I call a lot of people call the assumption of negative intent, which means if you don't tell me something positive, I will assume something negative. And it's how human brains work, and it's really unfortunate. But that means that a lot of these C-suite leaders who are very afraid of screwing up the acronym, and I like to jokingly say that you have to have a PhD in gay to be able to speak about gay issues these days, because we keep adding letters and acronyms, et cetera, which is important to be inclusive, of course, but it does make it hard for our allies who are still trying to just figure out the LGBT, much less the I, the Q, the S, the A, the plus, et cetera. So I do tell allies they have to come out and that they have to be okay and not worry about making a mistake. I also really focus on, actually, as Erica said, you were talking about the white privilege, and I'm very aware that I have white male and passing privilege, which has helped me throughout my career. And I've really focused on using that to do the good that I feel like I've been able to accomplish thus far in my career. But the whole concept of allyship sometimes is too focused, I think, on privilege and almost deigning to give those people who need your help your privilege, right? And I was at a conference last year and I heard an amazing woman who actually was one of the founders of Campaign Zero speak. And she actually had a term that I loved, and I know Caroline, when we were on the call a couple of weeks ago, we shared this. The idea of allyship can be this power dynamic that I mentioned. And she talks about being an accomplice instead of being an ally. And the idea of an accomplice is that that person is beside you. They are in the trench with you, and you are planning and plotting to overthrow whatever the issue is together. And I really like that. I really like that idea that you're actually in the fight together. And, you know, as we saw with Black Lives Matter, people putting their bodies out there was the way to do that, in the same way that coming out as an ally, as an LGBT ally, is putting yourself out there and being an accomplice and coming beside that person to help them. And then the final quick thing I'll mention is that it really does impact a broader spectrum than you realize. So from an LGBT perspective, we have research that shows if a straight white male says he's an LGBT ally, the overall engagement of women and people of color in his organization goes up. Because what you do for an invisible minority like LGBTQ people actually sends a message to all the visible minorities that you're supportive, because it's a whole lot harder for some of these companies, especially because up until a month ago in 29 states, you could still legally be fired for being gay. So there are still specific issues that gay and lesbian people have to face in the United States. Obviously, and trans people have the most challenges, and trans people of color have even the most challenges. And so the idea that this intersectional ally approach is really driving our mission. We actually just published last month the first ever ally research, global ally research called Ally Up. It's a 5-part series, and the first piece was published in June, and we'll be sharing it with everyone after this. But then the next several pieces will be focused. We have data on 11 countries, but the next piece will be focused on intersectional allies, and we're partnering with the Color of Change, the Obama Foundation, and the Black Justice Coalition. So I'm excited to continue to sort of use the LGBT conversation as a way to actually underpin some of these cultural challenges that companies have, but ultimately always bringing it back to the fact that this matters to their bottom line, because companies will do what's in their bottom line sustainable best interest long term. And if we can always tie it back to that and make it an economic challenge for them if they don't, then I think we win.
Thank you so much, Todd, and we can't wait to see those resources as well. So I'm doing my Brady Bunch looking this way to Tatiana. And so building on what Todd said about convening talent and equality and allies have to come out, I was watching your Lions of Justice YouTube video, which is really great. And you were saying that, you know, since the age of 7, you wanted to be on the red carpet. You wanted to be a multi-hyphenate performer in terms of dance and modeling. And you said, you know, I had joy to share. And also, you know, you've just been so resilient, and God bless your mom. But you said, you know, you were picked on in school and you just never saw anyone like yourself doing these things, and you had really specific goals. So based on all of those experiences, and then I do want you to talk about coming to LA, how has that informed and also defined not only your allyship, but your activism?
Thank you. So I mean, like you said, since I was 7, I wanted to act and model and be in front of the camera. Actually, my mom bought me a Polaroid camera. I'll never forget it. And the first thing I did was do a photo shoot in the front yard. And that was when I knew I wanted to be in front of the camera. And I was met with people telling me that that was something I could never achieve. I mean, I am a plus size Black woman who uses a wheelchair. I was born with my disability. I was born with a birth defect called spina bifida. And I didn't see representation of myself. And I watched Living Single, and yes, seeing Erica play that role was pivotal for me, and seeing a strong Black woman that could speak her mind and be independent and just be badass at everything that she did. But for me, I still didn't have it because there wasn't a step further. I did not see someone who lived with a disability. So therefore, I could never fully connect with even the Black women characters that I saw. And so from there, it, you know, brought me to LA. I went and majored in marketing and business school because I wanted to learn how to interject pop culture, interject disability into pop culture norms, because I did not see that at all. And the very few times you did, it was maybe once or twice, the person did not have a disability. So what does that do for me as a person living with a disability when that person is getting up and all of a sudden walking now and they live their life? They don't live their life like I do. And so, yes, I hopped on a plane and said, you know what, I am going to give it a shot. No matter how much throughout my life, you know, being picked on, being teased, people telling me that no one was ever going to want to see a Black girl with a disability on the cover of a magazine or be a lead in a film or on a TV show. It was like, no, I'm going to go and see what happens, and moved to LA. And when I got here, I realized one of the major barriers were for me, and I think that this is something that people don't think about, is that there's actual physical and environmental barriers for people with disabilities to break into this industry. And that's what informed my activism at first, because people would tell me, oh, just go show up to networking events and go meet people. And I would go and show up to networking events. I had friends that were like, oh, so-and-so's gonna be here and so-and-so's gonna be there. Come to this event, come see it. And the place would not be wheelchair accessible. And when I would ask people, like, how do I get in? How do I get in? And people would say, I don't know. And it's like, it's 2015. How do you not know if a place is wheelchair accessible? And just this past week, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which basically is a law that informs that if a place exists that is public property, it should be accessible to people with disabilities, and it is not, even after 30 years. And so I started blogging about it and writing about it and just saying, hey, you know, I'm here, I'm a person with a disability, and I want a shot just like anyone else. And that's where, you know, my activism came into play. And I had no intentions of wanting to be an activist or just even study this topic. I just wanted to come to LA, study to be an actor, and just live my best life. But then I would even go to acting studios that were some of the best acting studios. And do you know what? They're not even wheelchair accessible. I went and checked out Stella Adler School. I literally had to take my wheelchair and drag it up the steps just to check out a class, which should not have to be, is literally against the law. And so I was like, okay, there needs to be more of this. And I thought that, you know, someone with a disability didn't want to be in the industry. I didn't realize there were literal barriers. And then from there, I started opening up umbrellas for me. And I'm very, very fortunate, considering all the barriers that I've had in the industry. I've gotten to work with huge brands. My very first campaign project when modeling was with Apple. Then I've gone on to model for like ModCloth and Torrid and so many other brands, and done some really great stuff, won some awards for a lot of short films that I've done, and then even the first person of color to receive the Christopher Reeve Scholarship, and really have made way. But then it's like, it's still hard to even get an audition for like bigger roles, because then people say, well, you know, they're not a big enough name. And it's like, well, if you don't think about it, they're known in their own communities. So it's like, you may not know them wider, but they're known in their communities. And there's so many talented actors with disabilities, you know, that are doing a lot of this work and doing all of the things that Hollywood asked them to do. But then you still have these gatekeepers of believing, well, if you're an actor with a disability, you don't really know how to act. We would just be hiring you just because you have a disability and not because you're a good actor. And it's like, well, if you were to know the literal barriers that exist for them, and just give them a shot, because even so, there's, you know, with my scholarship, I got private coaching and, you know, constantly get private coaching because there's no places that are accessible. And even with COVID, you know, now everything's online, which people don't realize is accessible for the most part to people with disabilities. So that informed my activism, and then started being able to be in rooms that other people in my community weren't in. Speaking on behalf of SAG-AFTRA, and also speaking LA Film Festival, and then which then led into my work with Respectability, which we are a disability advocacy nonprofit, and doing this work. And there was a position now. So now it's like, oh, okay, I'm a working actress trying to make my way through Hollywood. And now I have a full-time job where I can work doing the activism that I love to do. Like, that is unheard of. And so doing this work and consulting different organizations and consulting different studios and letting them know the way people with disabilities want to be depicted. Because not only that, when you see the stories about disability, that's not the way the community wants to be portrayed. Just like you said, and the storylines that are about disability, most of the time, the kid dies. It's like, really? So therefore, nobody with a disability is living and thriving and enjoying their life and going out to the club and dating and having relationships and worried about what they're wearing and how their hair and their makeup looks like. That's my life. My life is not me worried about, oh my gosh, I hate my disability. I don't want to be disabled. Oh my gosh, I want to walk one day. And no, that's not realistic to the life of living with a disability. And I think that's important to show, because going back to me being that little girl, I didn't have anything that told me that I could be a lawyer, I could be a doctor, I could be a mom, or I could even be in a relationship, in a loving relationship, and have sex. Like, that doesn't exist. And so I didn't have that for me. And I said, I will never allow the future generation to not have that. And even now, with a lot of the modeling campaigns I've done, just to hear young Black girls with disabilities say, you made me feel proud to be who I am, and embrace my body and enjoy who I am, just how I am and how I show up in the world. That matters. That matters so much. And, and so it's important to tell those stories, not only that in the right way, but tell it authentically. No one can tell my story the way I tell my story. You hear these stories of people wanting to take someone who does not have a disability and portray that life experience. And so therefore, not only that, you're taking a job opportunity from an actor with a disability who isn't getting a job opportunity otherwise. Because me as a Black actress, wheelchair or not, I don't get to audition for the roles that is for the Black actress or just the assistant or the best friend. It's like, no, I only get called in for the woman in a wheelchair or the wheelchair user or the woman of color in a wheelchair, which is far and few between. And so things that I think that people that want to be allies, like Todd said, you have to let it be known, and you have to be intentional about it, because most of the diversity and inclusion conversations that come up, we're not included in those. We aren't seen as part of the diversity and inclusion, even though we make up 20% of the population. People with disabilities are the largest marginalized community, and we intersect into every other community. We intersect into LGBTQ, we intersect into people of color, we intersect in male, female, and even the most marginalized. There are people that are out there that are doing amazing things that are trans, Black, and disabled. I mean, so that intersect into all of those things. So I think you have to be intentional with including people with disabilities. And, I love being able to work with, collaborating with the Geena Davis Institute. You guys have been a great resource for respectability and us, growing in our small organization and really advocating for disability. But just the little things like having an ASL interpreter at an event, making sure wheelchair accommodations is a priority, just things like that, and actually auditioning real actors with disabilities, because there are a whole plethora of us that are out there in the community right here in Hollywood that are looking for their chance to just be that star, so that people can say, oh, that actor with a disability exists, and therefore they've had these small roles, and now they just need that one big opportunity. And we've proven with movies like Peanut Butter Falcon and so much more that we can be money making. And then actually a great selling point that I love to point out, and this is the last thing I will say, is the disability market is worth over $1 trillion. There was a study done by Nielsen, and the disability market, we are the third largest market in the world, worth over $1 trillion, and it hasn't even been tapped into. So it's not only the right thing to do because we're a huge population, but it's the economically smart thing to do.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. And building on what you said about embracing your body and redefining, reimagining pop culture, Virgie, I want to turn to you. And I read in your article, Freedom, Failure, and Rebellion, you said, you know, I come from a long line of fat Mexican chichones. I know I didn't say that right. You are a cyber feminist, award-winning, you know, author. Also, you said that tiny hats bring you joy. I don't know, that's kind of interesting. But, you know, you've said, you know, you have to look beyond traditional modes, you know, of activism, which you've done. And so, you know, one interesting thing I was reading in an article you did for Chicago Maroon, you know, you grew up in the church, and you spent one of your summers as a teenager doing crazy aerobics for like 3 hours a day. And your doctor, now you were a teenager at the time, I believe, and your doctor said, hey, if you lose more weight, you may be able to date one of my sons, right? It's like, what is that, you know, message? So anyway, and then you said you kind of found your way through a group of activists which kind of changed your life. So how did all of this go into the soup mix, and these experiences inform your allyship and your activism and kind of where you are, you know, right now?
Yeah, I love those facts. Thank you for having me, and it's been such a joy, and it's been so humbling to listen to the other panelists. And I was taking notes on things that I wanted to spin off of. But yeah, I mean, that experience with my doctor happened when I was 11. And I think an important thing to really contextualize what the experience of weight stigma is and fat phobia is that in our culture, there's a presumptive fat phobia. There's a presumptive belief that higher weight people are inferior, physically, health-wise, romantically, intellectually, and all kinds of things. And really that presumptiveness creates a reality in which fat people feel like we are deviant consistently. And it's almost like the bigotry is so pervasive that it's actually really, it's quite invisible actually to most people, because it's written into the way we think and we speak, and certainly the representation we see consistently in mass media. So for me, I had to literally be told by another person, did you know that there's nothing wrong with being higher weight? Did you know that you don't have to be on a diet? Did you know that you don't have to dedicate your entire life to becoming a thin person? And one of the biggest things that I share with people who are new to the concept of weight-based discrimination is that a fat person or a higher weight person is actually not a failed thin person. I have an autonomous existence. Body size is primarily determined by genetics. So I have an autonomous standalone existence that is not the space left over by thin people. I am not living in the space of failure that thin people have left behind. When I kind of I thought about the question of, you know, what makes a good ally in terms of someone, you know, when I think of my ideal ally, it starts with a simple thought, which is that person understands that my body is not the problem, that weight-based bigotry, which is socially promoted, is. And that reframe is really significant when we're thinking about departing from the way that we understand body size in our culture. I could talk about all of the sort of like the science around weight and how diets don't work and how, right? I mean, I think one really compelling statistic that I learned was that the chances of a higher weight person longitudinally becoming a thin person are less than 1%, and that the body experiences, you know, dieting and all this kinds of really rigorous weight restriction behavior as a threat to its survival. I mean, very distressing. And that kind of leads me to representation, right? So as Carolyn mentioned, higher weight characters are typically portrayed as comic relief. Similar to what Tatiana talked about, higher weight characters are presumptively unhealthy, about to die, or presumably going to die unless they become a thin person. They're portrayed as villains, unusually selfish or otherwise lacking in morality, always dissatisfied with their body. There is no reality in which we stay higher weight and we just are living our best lives. Highly sexualized or inappropriately romantically aggressive. My first example of this was Miss Piggy. Idiotic, slovenly, or disheveled. One thing that I find really particularly troubling is that plus size characters are more likely to be portrayed in private or humiliating moments, like going to the bathroom or getting food on their clothes or their face. These are obviously really dehumanizing characterizations. And they have really big impacts. They have impacts on, like, for example, one of the things that higher weight people experience because of that phobia is something called minority stress. Ironically, even though, right, as was pointed out, plus size women in particular make up 68% of the US population, and yet we experience minority stress because that phobia is so pervasive. And what minority stress is the ongoing experience of stress. It's like the physiological side of discrimination. People of color experience this, queer people experience this, disabled people experience this, right? And it's essentially a perpetual state of hypervigilance or fight or flight. And this creates kind of a heightened, like it creates more adrenaline, it creates more stress hormones, this affects the heart, this affects the immune system. And representations, when we see them that reaffirm this idea that we're not fully human, those create stress responses. And I mean, for me, going back to like all these sort of, you know, growing up in the church and all these facts that you pointed out, Madeline, you know, I grew up watching those characterizations, watching fat women get rejected, watching fat women do everything in their power to become thin women so they could be loved, and to get dignity. I mean, it wasn't even just about the romantic outcome, the possibility and access to love from a potential romantic partner. It was dignity at all. And it created a reality in which it was impossible to imagine my life even beginning unless I had paid my penance as a fat person. And it wasn't until I was introduced to body positivity and fat activism that I began to see that the problem wasn't my body. The problem was the social creation of fat phobia. The problem wasn't that I wasn't lovable. The problem was that I had been taught that something was wrong with me. And when I sort of bring it back to allyship, I really do think, again, it underscoring, right, that it is important to recognize that it is not my body that is the problem. It is a culture that is entirely committed to making my life miserable for living in my body.
Thank you so much, Virgie. I really, really appreciate that. So as we said in the beginning, and now we're going to bring on Dr. Nicole Haggard to walk us through, you know, allyship, you know, is an action, and you've heard from all of our wonderful panelists. And I'm going to ask all the panelists to stay on because after Nicole walks us through actions for allyship, then we're going to go right into some Q&A, but I want to give her a proper introduction because she deserves it. So Dr. Nicole Haggard is our Director of Communications, but she is an expert in race and gender in American culture. She's also faculty for our fiscal sponsor, who we love and adore, Mount St. Mary's University. She's also the co-founder of CME, the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment. So Nicole, why don't you take us through some of your closing remarks and how we can all put our own action plan together for being an ally.
Thank you so much, Madeline. This panel has been amazing, and hearing the intersectionality really present and all of the overlap has just been great. So I wanted to just go through a few points that we heard from some of the panelists to really bring those home for everybody that's listening. Todd and Tatiana actually both brought up this idea of the financial opportunities here, right? Like, it doesn't just make mental sense, it makes money sense too, right? And so where are you looking for those opportunities? Tatiana also wanted us to check a few boxes as we're going through these things, right? Like, when you're considering where you're holding an event, have you checked where what the physical barriers are, right? When you're hiring somebody in costume, makeup, wardrobe, like, are you making sure that they also are inclusive when it comes to disability, that they're inclusive when it comes to body size? That's a great one, right? We often talk about makeup and different skin colors. And so making sure that the people that you are hiring also have experience in these areas. Valerie was really was really getting us to think about this mental shift, right? And I'm gonna speak on that a little further, but I'm gonna go back to something that Erica was really asking us to do. And that's to think about how we are here to be good people, which I think that, that idea of being good people is really interesting, but especially in the workplace, right? And so for us at CME, when we think about what's going on in workplaces right now, there is a huge rush to make your workplaces more diverse, right? And often that just means hiring incredibly talented and brilliant people that bring some of these other areas that you don't have, which, knowing that our workforce is mostly white, right? So it usually looks like bringing more people of color to the table. What's going on with your workplace culture? You're bringing them into these spaces, but your culture is not one that actually allows them to thrive and succeed because you haven't done the work on your workplace culture. We are very comfortable talking about what patriarchy looks like in these environments. We are not so comfortable looking at what white supremacy means. We aren't even comfortable with the word white supremacy yet, right? Like, we'll say racism all the time. We say sexism in a patriarchal culture. We say racism in a white supremacist culture because we are all products of this culture. So what work are you doing on yourself? It can start with you in your workplace community, right? You already have a bunch of tools in this area because we've all been fighting this patriarchal fight, right? We know this idea of amplification, right? When somebody says something, you repeat it and you give them credit for it, right? So doing this for diversity hires in your workplace too, right? And not even thinking of them as diversity hires. They are people who they don't make your company diverse. One person is not diverse, your whole company is diverse, right? And so how are you making your workplace a safe space for diversity to flourish? So also, when we're thinking about this, how do you do this sort of inner work that you need to do to root out white supremacy out of yourself? And one of those areas is, we've heard a lot about white fragility lately, right? Like, everybody's reading Robin DiAngelo's book. And oftentimes that comes out that somebody will say something to you or call you out on something and you get defensive, right? You feel it in your body and you start, but I'm not a racist, right? Instead, take a deep breath, say thank you for pointing that out, and then go home and look it up. What were they talking about, right? We're always asking, well, what should I look up? What should I learn about? When you have these sort of physical responses in you, that's a great clue for you of what you should be going home to Google. So when somebody tells you something and you have that white fragility response, instead of like trying to defend it, just breathe and say thank you, right? And go home, Google. Another thing, and that goes to what Virgie was saying as well, right? That, like, it is this literal mental shift that needs to take place. It's a bigotry that we don't even realize because we don't talk about whiteness in our culture. And so another way to do some of this digging out work, I want to give you a couple of resources, and I know we're sending out a resource guide as well. There's a popular book out right now, Me and White Supremacy. That's a good one you can get. Rachel Cargile has a 30-day sort of activist plan that you can do. CME, we have a workshop called Hollywood, Me and White Supremacy. So there's lots of resources out there for you to look into. And another shift that I wanted you to think about while you're creating characters on screen, we so often talk about characters like, what are we doing with our BIPOC characters? Well, are you considering what you're doing with your white characters? Do you even think of them as white? And how are you thinking about how through your white characters, you're perpetuating this idea of white supremacy in this culture that we live in? Because invisible whiteness is also a big thing. So those are just a couple things. And so I want to kick off the Q&A for us. So actually this question is for Todd and Tatiana. You guys both gave us that really great sort of word of allies coming out, right? Can you guys both model for us what that would look like? You know, like what sort of words you could use? You walk into a room full of strangers. How do you come out as an ally?
Well, I'll briefly dive in. I've actually got to hop off in just a second. I have another podcast at 5. I was telling Madeline. So if Tatiana, if you'll indulge me by going first, I would have loved to start with you. I think it all has to do with language and how you approach whatever conversations you have. So for example, if you're talking to someone, you walk up and they have a wedding ring, for example, don't immediately assume that they have a wife. Ask about their partner. Using inclusive language is a super easy way to do it. And even pushing buttons. So there was a CEO in Australia that we coached who was being introduced to his entire new company. And throughout his entire speech, he talked about his partner. Now he is straight and married to a woman, but he never referenced her gender. And so that was a beautiful way for him to actually show that he was an ally, because it created questions. Half the audience was like, well, gosh, is he gay? We don't know. Wow, we could have a gay CEO. No, but he was comfortable enough in his sexual orientation and his allyship to actually create that quote unquote confusion. And it's simple things like that. I think the thing not to do is to go in and say, I'm an ally, I have gay friends, just like you wouldn't say it with any other minority, right? You have to show it. It's all about action. We call the first piece of our ally research, ally is a verb, because you really do have to make it an action-oriented approach. So with that, I apologize to have to scoot. I was blown away to be a part of this, you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
And to piggyback off of that, kind of the same thing, think about inclusive language. When it comes to people with disabilities, a lot of times people's first response to me will be, what happened to you? It's like, that's not the way you approach someone with a disability. You just say, hi, how are you? What's your name? And then ask questions. So approach it in that way. And then also let it be known. Ask the person with a disability if you want to join them somewhere or invite them somewhere. Do a lot of the work for them, you know, find out if the place is accessible for them, or is there going to be an interpreter, or is it wheelchair accessible? Things like that. That shows that you support and that you care. And then not only that, ask the person with a disability, what do they need to fully participate? And I think a lot of times people make assumptions and assume that we don't know what we need. Majority of the time, if you ask a person with a disability what they need, they've been advocating for themselves their entire life, so they know what they need. Just ask. And I think that, and just making sure intentionally that your spaces are inclusive and using language. Don't say disabled person or woman in a wheelchair. Use their name, and, you know, or ask them how they want to be referenced. Some people, sometimes I interchange the word disabled woman or woman with a disability depending on who I'm talking to or how I'm feeling that day. That's just the way I choose to identify. And I think the main thing is that people just need to understand that disability is just an identity and a life experience, and just how they identify and going about the world, and just that.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. So unfortunately, we're at time, but I did want to say we've captured all of your questions, and we will pose all these questions to our panelists. And as long as we have your email, we'll email you the answers. So I really want to thank everyone for joining us, our esteemed panelists, Nicole, you know, Caroline. And then I just wanted to let you know that we're going to have another event August 11th, and it's called Beyond Checking Boxes, Inclusion versus Exclusion in Global Advertising. So we hope all of you will join us for that. And again, this is only possible with all of your support and your continued support. So thank you to all of you, our treasured members. And we look forward to seeing you on August 11th. Thanks, everybody.